What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a chainsaw katana. This cool concept was originally created by an awesome artist named Muju, and I just thought it'd be really fun to recreate for this week's model. So let's just dive into it. Alright, so to start things off, I'm going to select the cube and start blocking out all the main shapes. I thought the easiest way to go about this for proportions would just be creating the blade first, and then we could model everything else around that. So the first thing that came to mind when creating this blade was to use mesh. Just like I would create a tank track or anything along those lines, I could just duplicate it along a curve and it could just loop all the way around. Now I knew this would be a little bit challenging just because I wanted to create more than one link, just to have different variations of teeth. And without rigging it, it wouldn't really know where that pivot point was in that link. So when I actually use that mesh tool to create all of the links around the curve, it wouldn't necessarily know where to bend. So instead of spending more time figuring out how to do it properly and rigging it up and all that, I just decided to manually adjust those links along the curves. So I'll show you that soon when we start using mesh to create all the other links. Also, I just wanted to mention, I usually try to keep the modeling proportions of these videos around 2 hours or less in real time, just so then I'm not creating a massive 5-hour plus video to YouTube. Now this week's model definitely went over that. I ended up spending around 3 hours-ish modeling this, and that's just because I was being a little bit lazy, and honestly, I blame COVID. I had COVID last week and I'm still getting over that. So if I sound a little sick, that's probably why. So bear with me as we just wrap up the rest of this link and then we can create the rest of the blade. Alright, so the links are looking good, and I thought before creating all the other ones I should just UV these ones ahead of time just to save myself the work. So all I'm doing here is an automatic UV, and then I'm just going in and clicking those edges and sewing them together. Now I forgot to freeze the transformation, so really quickly just deleting history, freeze transformations, and center pivot, and then I can unfold it properly to get the actual shape. So all I'm going to do here is just go through the rest of these links with the multi-cut tool and just clean them up a little bit to make sure there's no faces that are more than 4 sides. And then I can finish wrapping up the rest of the UVs, and then we can go ahead and use that mesh tool to create the rest of the blade. Alright, so now that we have those two teeth all UV'd and ready to go, we're just going to move those UVs aside until later on in the video. And we're going to go create a curve and start moving those points into the shape of our blade. And really quickly before going on to use that mesh tool, I thought we would just create a small sphere, chop it in half to create some small little bolts or some sort of attachment that are on those links. Just to add that small little detail. Now you could definitely get away with this in the texture, so if you wanted to create a lower poly model for a video game or something, you definitely don't, and you probably wouldn't do this. But just for the sake of the video, to add a little bit more detail, I'm going to go ahead and do this ahead of time. Alright, so now that our link is looking good, we can go ahead and select it, go up to our mesh tab on the top, and then go create a mesh network. So next I just have to go over to the right, click a curve to create a curve node, middle click that curve we created earlier, and then drag it into our input curves. And then I just have to go over to the mesh distribute tab, click the drop down and change it from linear to initial state. And then just increase the number of points. Then all I have to do after is go to that mesh curve tab, just increase the steps so they go all the way around to match up with the other side. At this point it's just a matter of increasing the number of points so it connects properly so all those links line up. Now as you can see on the very ends of those curves, they kind of blew up and they're not following that curve properly. And that's just because those little links are quite long and they actually don't know where to bend. You could probably rig it somehow, or you can spend some time just tweaking some of these settings. And I honestly just did not have the energy to invest my time into figuring out how to make this work. So all I did was just manually adjust those links on the very ends. So I'm just going to speed up this next portion of the video, as that's all I'm doing is just rotating these little links to match up with that curve correctly. And also I'm just focusing on one side rather than doing my work twice. I'm just going to chop it in half once I'm happy with it, and I can just duplicate it and flip it over to the other to create my whole chain. So let's just go ahead and start wrapping up this blade. Alright, so now that we have our chain created, I'm going to go ahead and select a cylinder and we can start blocking out the rest of the blade. So all I do here is just select half of the cylinder and then drag it all the way to the other side. Now I did a little bit of a sloppy job here. It doesn't have the exact same amount of points that I selected on each side, so the cylinder is a little bit off and I have to just add a couple edge loops just to make it line up correctly with my chain. Now a cleaner and more accurate way of doing this would be chopping that cylinder directly in half and then duplicating it to the other side and then re-bridging it together. That way you have the correct amount of points and you don't have to basically add those edge loops in between to make them line up perfectly with your chain. I just did it really quickly. Like I said, I was trying to rush this model and I wasn't feeling 100%, so I blame COVID, but it is what it is. We just did it a little bit sloppier and you can definitely do a cleaner job if you take your time. Alright, so now that our chain is complete, I'm going to go ahead and start blocking out the other shapes. So I'm going to select the cube, we can start blocking out that middle component that starts attaching the blade to the rest of the chainsaw. Now I'm just going to keep it really low in poly. It's basically just going to look pretty awful for a while until all these shapes start coming together, and then we can start increasing some polys and beveling some edges and start making it look a little bit better. So let's just start blocking things out. Alright, and we're going to do the exact same thing once again. We're going to select another cube and we can start blocking out that piece that covers the top of the blade. Alright, so the front of our chainsaw slash katana is looking good. We just need to start blocking out the other components. So I'm going to select the cube and we can start blocking out that handle that sits right on top. Alright, so next up we're just creating that main handle on the back. So I'm just going to create a cylinder and we can start extruding that edge just to give it a little bit of a curve like those katana swords usually have. So let's go ahead and start blocking that out. Alright, so the chainsaw katana is slowly coming together. I just want to continue blocking out the rest of those main shapes. So I'm just going to work on that little motor piece that sits in the middle. So I'm just going to start adding cubes and cylinders and start blocking out those main shapes. Now I didn't know exactly how I wanted all these shapes to look and fit. There's a little bit of experimenting along the way. So let's just go ahead and start blocking the rest of these shapes out. I'm just going to speed up the next part of this video until all of those main shapes are in place. Alright, and just like that, all of the main shapes are in place. So we're going to go ahead and just adjust a few small things, and then we can jump to those little grips that are over the back handle. Alright, so for this back grip, I didn't really know how I wanted to go about it. My reference was showing that classic Katana handle that has that like woven fabric material that's kind of like a stitching pattern that's across the whole back handle. And I was thinking of doing that originally, and that would be pretty straightforward, just creating one little piece and then I could just duplicate that same fabric piece over and over again. But I thought, just to make the video a little bit quicker and possibly easier for myself, I thought I would just do a regular leather strap that was kind of wrapped around all the way up the back handle. So to do that, I'm just going to create a little cylinder, and I'm just going to go ahead and bevel some of those edges, and we can start playing around with that shape until I get one piece that looks good. And we can go ahead and UV that ahead of time, just like we did those chainsaw pieces, just to save myself from doing that extra work. And then we can go ahead and start duplicating those leather pieces all the way up my handle. Now I'm more or less just blocking them out and get them into place, and then later on during the UVing process I come back and start playing around with those straps to make them look more wrapped around like they're actually one piece rather than just the same piece that's duplicated a bunch of times. So for the time being, let's just go ahead and block those out, and then we can come back and rework them and modify them a little bit more later on. To be honest, this is the one part of the model that I really wasn't that happy with. If I could go back and fix anything, it would just be this back grip. I would have spent a little bit more time making it look a little bit more realistic, but it is what it is. The model already took longer than I originally planned, so sometimes there just isn't enough time. Alright, so like I mentioned, I didn't want to spend too much time on those grips, and I could always come back to them later on, so they're good for the time being. Let's just start moving on to those tiny little pieces of string that I also added onto those grips. So all I'm going to do here is just reuse one of those grips I already created. I'm just going to duplicate one of those over, scale that nice and thin. I can delete some of those extra edge loops that are just unnecessary, and then once I get one piece that's looking pretty good, I can start duplicating all my other pieces of string. Alright, so now that we have all those grips blocked out and in place, I'm going to jump back to some other shapes in our model and start modifying a few things. So all I'm going to do is just start scaling some of these shapes to make them fit a little bit better, and I can start beveling some of these edges. Now this isn't completely necessary depending on what your model is going to be used for. In my case, this is just going to be used for some renders, so I'm not too worried about the poly count or anything like that, so we can go ahead and start beveling some of these edges and start creating a higher poly model. And if you haven't noticed already, I am just focusing on one side of this model, just to make my life a little bit easier rather than redoing my work. I'm just going to focus on this one side, finalize all the shapes and UV them, and then once we're happy with that, I can then duplicate them and mirror them over to create the other side. Alright, so things were coming along and I thought we were almost done the modeling part, but then I realized I missed this one object that sits right on the top. It's like a little cover for the exhaust, I believe. Either way, I thought it was really cool and it would add a little bit of extra something on that top of the model. So all I'm going to do is create a little cube, delete all those spaces so I just have a little plane to work with, and I can start just blocking out the shape. Once I'm happy with that, I can just leave it one-sided for now. I can create some lower poly cylinders, and I can group those all into one object and boolean out a bunch of holes, and then I just need to go in with my multi-cut tool afterwards and clean it up a little bit. So let's go ahead and just wrap up this last shape that sits on the top of the model. Alright, so once that boolean is created, all of these vertices are quite messy. So we're gonna first go in with our target weld tool. We can start attaching some of these empty vertices that are living on our edges. Now, as you can see, during the boolean process, it automatically creates some random edges that are attached to little weird vertices. And sometimes if you go ahead and delete these edges ahead of time, you'll have a problem attaching some of the vertices. So before removing them, I'm going to go ahead with the multi-cut tool. I can start just attaching some vertices to these empty points along those booleans we created. Once all of those vertices are attached, then I can go in afterwards and remove all the unnecessary edges from our booleans. So let's just go ahead and clean up this shape a little bit. So like I mentioned earlier, I was trying to do this model really quickly and I actually did a pretty sloppy job when it came to this piece. So you could definitely do a much better job if you take your time and really worry about your edge flow and how you're attaching all of these vertices. You obviously want to try to keep it to 4 sides or less. You really don't want to go more than 4-sided faces. So if you spend a little bit more time than I did, you can get a much better result. But in my case, this was looking pretty good. So I decided just to go with it, and since I only created booleans on one side, I decided just to chop it in half, duplicate it over to create the other side so I have one complete shape. Then once I'm happy with that, I can go ahead and double click all of those edges that we created from those booleans and give them a small bevel. That way when I hit 3 on my keyboard and I smooth the shape out, I'm getting no weird artifacts on any of these faces and everything's looking like it should. Now I could have easily kept this one-sided, but I decided to give it a little bit of thickness, so I went ahead and selected all of those faces, extruded it, and just gave it a small thickness so it was double-sided. Alright, so the modeling was almost complete. I thought it would just be nice adding a few small details. So I thought it'd be cool to add some sort of ancient old coin that was hanging on the back of the handle. That was basically just held up with string and just kind of dangling on the back. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and create an EP curve tool. I can draw out a few points depending on how I want that curve to look, and then I can turn that into a sweep mesh once I position that right on the back end of my handle. And once I'm happy with the shape of that string, I can go ahead and create another little cylinder for my coin. I'm just going to scale that nice and small, give those edges a small bevel, and position that at the bottom of that string. Then all I'm going to do is create another EP curve tool to create a small little line that's going around, basically in an oval, just to fit around my coin as if there was a string that was wrapped around holding it in place. Now I'm not going to worry too much about the shape. It's so small in my scene, and string isn't perfectly rounded anyways, so those imperfections almost add to the model, I think, in waves. So I'm not worrying too much about getting it perfect. I just want to roughly get this shape in place. then all I'm going to do is just select that original string that's holding our coin, and I'm just going to duplicate that and flip it around. That way it just looks a little bit more realistic, like there's a string that's wrapped around holding it in place. Alright, so now just for one final small detail, I'm just going to select that half cylinder we created on the back of our handle, and I'm just going to duplicate that and start pasting these small little bolts all over my model. Now this really isn't necessary, you can definitely get away with this in the texture, and I do add small other bolts and screws and little details into my textures later on in Substance, but adding these small little details will definitely add to the model, and it's just going to make it look a little bit cooler in my opinion. So let's go ahead and start pasting these little half cylinders all over my model. Alright, and just like that, we are done the whole modeling part of the video. So now really quickly before getting into texturing, I'm just going to go over exactly how I did these UVs. Alright, so here I am fast forwarded ahead, and here's the finished model in its finished form. I ended up just mirroring over all those objects we created on this one side to the other, and I added a few small details, nothing major, but I ended up just beveling out some of these extra edges and touching up a few of the shapes until I was happy with them. Alright, so now let me show you exactly how I did those UVs. So I broke this model up into 3 different textures. Now I could have easily done 2, which probably would have made more sense, but since I'm not limited by anything with this model, I thought I can get a little bit more out of those textures and resolution if I broke it up into 3. So the first one is all these middle components that sit around the motor. The second texture consists of the blade, all those little teeth, and then the back grips, which I just made sure to straighten on my UV map. And then the third one was just all the other components in the middle as well as the back handle. Now, like I said, I could have easily combined that first and last texture map, so all those middle components were in one, but it is what it is. I decided to go with 3. So that's exactly how I did all of those UVs. Now let's just jump into Substance Painter so we can start texturing. Alright, so now in Substance Painter, I can go load in my FBX file from Maya. Once that model's all loaded in, everything's looking good, I can go over to my texture set settings, scroll down to Bake Mesh Maps, and then I can choose my output size. So I chose 4K, and then make sure to check on that use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, and then we can bake out our textures. Alright, so to start things off, we're going to go ahead and start with our texture 2. Now this is a little bit backwards, but I should have put this as my first texture, but just basically the main blade and all the main pieces like the cover, and I thought this would be a good place to start. So what we're going to do is go over to our Smart Materials tab, and I can go choose one of these steel painted textures as our base color, and I'm just going to open up that folder and start tweaking some of these settings. I'm just going to basically drag down all that wear and tear since we're going to add our own masks later on for that grunge and dirt. And then I can just tweak that color. I'm going to make this base color a white, and then once I'm happy with the shade, I can go ahead and start adding a few masks to add a little bit of dirt and grunge effects over top of that. So for that dirt, all I'm going to do is create a fill layer, and I can go to my masks tab and just drag on whatever mask I'd like over top of that fill layer, and then I can just change the color depending on what color I want that grunge or dirt effect to be. Alright, so once I'm happy with all that dirt and grunge effect, I'm just going to scroll down to that white color we created earlier, and I'm just going to duplicate that. All I'm going to do is just change this white color to more of an orange, and once I'm happy with that shade, I can go ahead and switch that to a black mask. Then all I have to do is just go to my polygon fill tool. Now usually this is on mesh fill, and we click on whatever meshes we want to apply this material to. In this case, we're going to make sure it's on polygon fill, and we just want to click on all the faces we want to assign this material to rather than assigning it to the whole object. And once we're happy with how everything is looking, I can go ahead and right click, set this whole material to a black mask, and then we can switch it over from polygon fill to mesh fill and assign it to whatever meshes we want in our scene. So I wanted to have that same white material assigned to that middle mesh in our scene, but I didn't want to have that same grunge and dirt effect on it. So all I'm going to do is just duplicate that same material over we just created, and I'm just going to reassign it to that middle piece, but I'm just going to turn off that fill layer that's holding all that dirt and grunge effect. Alright, so next up was moving on to that blade. So I'm going to go back to that Smart Materials tab. I'm going to go choose one of these steel textures I'm going to use as a base, and I can start tweaking some of these settings and colors until I get a nice base color that I'm happy with. Alright, so once I'm happy with the color, I wanted to add a nice print of some dragon that was on this blade. So I quickly hopped on Google and found a random image of a dragon, and all I'm going to do is just add a new layer to this scene, and using that projection tool, I'm going to project this dragon image right onto my blade. So all I'm going to do is just drag this image I found online directly into my scene, set that as a texture to this current session, and then like I mentioned, on this new layer using that projection tool, I can go ahead and paste this dragon directly onto that blade. And then once I have that dragon pasted on my mesh, I'm going to go ahead and change that blending mode to pass through, and I can just play around with that opacity slider to help blend that graphic into my material. And then once I'm happy with how it's looking, I can go ahead and right click, set it to a black mask, and then reassign it to the blade. And once I'm happy with that, I can go to my eraser tool, go choose one of those dirt brushes, and I can start just erasing this graphic, just to add a little bit more detail into this blade so it doesn't look so clean. Alright, so next up is adding a little bit of dirt and grunge on top of this graphic, so I'm going to add another fill layer, go to my masking tab and I can drag on some different masks and play around with these colors and settings until I get a result that I'm happy with. Now I end up adding a few different fill layers with a few different masks just to layer on some different effects, and then I also go in with my eraser tool just to add a few little details. So let's go ahead and just wrap up this blade. Alright, so the blade's looking good. Next up is all of those little leather straps. So for this, I just go back to my Smart Materials tab. I end up going with one of those stylized leather materials, and then I end up just tweaking the color to be a little bit more orange. And once that leather material is applied to all of those little pieces, I can go ahead and choose another leather material to apply to those little strings that I have. Alright, so next up was just doing the little end piece on my handle, and that was pretty straightforward. I ended up choosing one of those steel materials in those Smart Materials tab and assigning it to that mesh. And then for that little flower imprint that's on the metal, I just added a fill layer and I turned off all of those different channels except for the height channel. And I just dragged up that height slider to have a little bit of bump in my material. And then I just went into my alphas tab and chose one of those built-in alphas that come with Substance. They actually have a really nice flower that I chose. And I basically just imprinted that alpha directly into my mesh. Alright, so next up was the coin, and similar to how we did that dragon graphic, I did the exact same thing. I jumped on Google, just searched up some ancient Japanese coin. I don't even know if this is Japanese, so I could be completely wrong, but it looked pretty cool, and I thought it'd be fitting for this model, so just save that as an image, drag that image directly into this project, assign that as a texture to this current session, and then using that projection tool, I can just project that image directly onto the mesh. Alright, so the coin's all wrapped up. Now I'm just going to zoom back and take a look at the model. And I noticed how that front piece that's covering my blade looked a little bit too clean. So just like we did before, I'm going to add a fill layer. I'm going to go to my mask tab and just drag on whatever mask I want to add a little bit of dirt and grunge on top of my material. Alright, so everything was looking pretty good. I decided to move on to my next texture set. Before we jump over to that, I'm just going to copy over that first texture, that white material we created, and then I can paste it over to my other texture. That tiny little piece on the back where we made all those little booleans is also the same white paint that's on that top cover piece, so to keep it all consistent, we're just going to copy it over. Alright, so next up is just all those other meshes that are directly in the middle where that motor is. So that's just going to be different types of metals. So I'm going to spend the next little bit going through these smart materials and applying different metals to these meshes. So all those metals are looking good. I just wanted to add that white material that we first created to those little tanks that are on the bottom. And I first assigned it over, but it looked way too dirty and grungy. So I'm just gonna jump back to that first material we created. I'm gonna copy over that clean white material that we duplicated, and I can reassign it to these tanks just so they're a little bit cleaner. And then similar to how we did those other leather straps, I'm just going to use that exact same stylized leather material, and I'm just going to assign it to those top meshes on my handle. Alright, so everything's coming together slowly. Next, I just wanted to jump back to those metal materials that we assigned to that motor, and I wanted to add a few extra details, like some imprints directly into the metals. So all I'm going to do for that is just create another fill layer. I'm going to turn off all of those channels just so we have the height channel only assigned, and I can drag down that slider depending on how much of an imprint we want into that metal. And then I just have to go to my alphas tab and then search through all of these alphas to find whatever imprint I want to make into these metals. So for the next little bit, let's go through and add some cool different alphas into these metals so we can have some nice looking details. Alright, so those metals are looking much better and they have a little bit more detail in them. Now we can move on to our last texture set. So just like we did before, we're going to go to our very first texture. We're going to copy over that same white and orange so we can keep it all consistent. And we're also going to copy over the same metals that we have applied. And we're going to paste those directly onto our meshes on our third texture set. So let's go ahead and copy those over. And then similar to how we did those details in our metals, we're going to do the exact same thing to all of these other meshes. So I'm going to create another fill layer, turn off all of the channels except for the height, drag that slider down depending on how much of an imprint I want into my mesh. And then I can go through my alphas and choose different alphas like little bolts and stuff to start printing and imprinting directly into these meshes. So let's go ahead and start adding in these small details. Alright, so the model's coming together and we're almost done. I just thought we should add a few extra markings on my blade. So I'm going to jump back to that very first texture we were working on. I'm going to open up that blade folder and I'm going to add another layer. Basically very similar to how we did that dragon imprint, I just jumped on Google and searched up different Japanese samurai words. Now these could be completely wrong, so I apologize if it's just complete nonsense and it's unrelated. I don't know Japanese, so I could very well be wrong here, but Google was telling me that these words were, I believe, warrior or things along those lines, and I thought it'd be fitting for the model, so save those images as JPEGs. So I copied those images over, dragged them directly into my substance file, set them as textures, just like we did our dragon, and then I can paste those directly onto my layer. And then all I'm going to do is just change the color to a black. I can change those roughness and metallic values. And then using the eraser tool, I can just erase some of it so it looks a little bit more marked up and it fits a little bit with the textures that are around it. Alright, so now I'm just going to jump into the renderer to take a look and see how these materials are looking. All I'm going to do here is just remove the floor and remove that background color. So usually right off the bat there's a few things that just jump out to me, like certain colors and reflectivities of certain metals and materials. So I'm just going to keep jumping back and forth for the next little bit as I just tweak some of the colors and settings on these materials. Alright, so all those materials were looking much better in my opinion, and we were almost wrapped up the whole texturing process. I just saw in the reference they had a little caution strip on one of those little pipings on the side, and I thought that would be cool, adding a little bit of yellow color and something extra since those pipes were looking a little bit plain. So very similar to how we do all the other little alphas in our scene, I'm going to create another fill layer. I'm going to go choose that stripe alpha, and I'm just going to paste that directly onto the mesh. And then I can just tweak some of those colors just so I have that nice black and yellow striped color on that piece of pipe. So let's go ahead and add that little small last detail. Alright, so the model's looking much better now, and honestly, we're just about done. There's just a few small little things that are still bugging me with the model, so I'm going to spend the next little bit once again jumping back and forth, just to make a few small changes to the settings and colors, and then we can wrap everything up. Alright, that's basically everything folks. That's the whole texturing and modeling process that I did to create this chainsaw katana. A big thank you to Muju for the original concept and design, and also Eugene Novikov, another artist's reference that I used to create this model. If you liked the video, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. And if you want to support the channel even further, as well as get access to additional content, check out my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. Alright, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.